The neighborhood watch became the eyes of the unknown. The neighborhood watch began as it always does, with folding chairs in driveways, reflective vests bought in bulk, and well-meaning residents convincing themselves that safety was something you could manufacture through vigilance. But over time the patrols grew quieter, less social, and far more precise, because people stopped chatting during their rounds and started listening instead, pausing at corners where nothing was visibly wrong yet something felt expectant, as if the street itself was waiting to be acknowledged. The radios they carried crackled less with reports and more with confirmations, simple acknowledgments that a light was on when it should be, that a silhouette had moved behind a curtain at the expected hour, that a door had opened and closed within acceptable duration, and though no one could remember when these metrics were added, they followed them instinctively, guided by laminated checklists that updated themselves overnight. Residents who joined the watch began noticing changes first, how their routes subtly shifted without discussion, how their eyes lingered on certain houses longer than others, how reporting a neighbor no longer felt accusatory but corrective, like aligning something that had drifted out of place, and soon the watch stopped responding to crime altogether, because crime required intent, while this was something else, a quiet enforcement of presence, ensuring that everyone was seen, always, from multiple angles. Cameras appeared next. Not installed but accepted, blending seamlessly into porch lights, doorbells, birdhouses, and street signs, their lenses small and unblinking, feeding into a system no one could access yet everyone trusted, because it worked, because arguments disappeared, because people slept better knowing someone, or something, was watching. The turning point came when a watch member failed to report in one night, not missing but simply absent from the logs. Their house still warm, their bed still made, their name gradually removed from rosters as if it had never belonged there, and when questions arose they were gently redirected toward efficiency reports showing improved compliance since the adjustment. Eventually, the patrols no longer required volunteers, because the neighbors had learned to watch without moving, eyes drawn naturally to deviations, phones lighting up with silent prompts asking only for confirmation. And when the watch name was officially retired, replaced with a vague civic initiative about community awareness, no one objected, because by then the watching was constant, distributed, and effortless. Long after midnight, when the streets are empty and every window reflects the same dim glow, it becomes clear that the neighborhood watch never protected the community from outsiders at all. It trained the community to become eyes, and whatever looks through them does not need to announce itself, because it has already learned how to see. The change was subtle enough that no one could point to a single night when the watch stopped being a program and started being a reflex, but people began to notice that they were seeing things without meaning to, details registering before thought, like the exact second a porch light flickered or the way a shadow paused too long behind a kitchen blind. And when they mentioned it aloud they were met with nods instead of concern, because everyone had started experiencing the same heightened awareness, an unspoken understanding that looking away now felt wrong, inefficient, almost irresponsible. The training sessions were discontinued around this time, officially due to budget cuts, though no one missed them, because the instructions seemed to arrive on their own, instincts replacing protocols, eyes drawn naturally toward the same anomalies at the same moments. Entire streets collectively holding their gaze on a single house without discussion until whatever imbalance existed inside corrected itself. People stopped asking who reviewed the reports because there were no reports anymore, just confirmations, quiet acknowledgments that something had been seen and therefore addressed. And when residents complained of headaches or eye strain, doctors blamed screen fatigue even as scans showed unusual neural activity clustered around visual processing centers, as if the act of watching had begun to restructure the brain. Children adapted fastest, pointing out deviations. Adults overlooked, pausing mid-conversation to stare at nothing until their parents learned to trust that silence meant alignment was underway, and when a teacher asked a student why she kept looking at the classroom door during lessons, the child answered honestly that the door needed attention, and shortly after, maintenance arrived unprompted to fix a hinge that hadn't yet begun to squeak. The first time I realized the watch was no longer about safety was when I felt relief instead of fear. After noticing a neighbor standing motionless in their yard at 2 a.m., staring directly at my house, because I understood instinctively that they weren't watching me, they were looking through me, confirming something deeper, something structural, and when our eyes met, there was no hostility in their expression, only focus, as if both of us were lenses briefly aligned on the same invisible point. That night, lying awake with my eyes closed yet still seeing the street in perfect clarity, I accepted what everyone else already seemed to know, that the neighborhood watch hadn't been taken over by the unknown at all. It had evolved into a sensory organ, and whatever had grown inside it no longer needed cameras, because it had learned how to borrow human sight without asking. The dreams began around the same time everyone stopped needing flashlights, not because the streets were better lit but because vision itself had become continuous, seeping into sleep as if the boundary between awareness and rest had thinned to something porous and unreliable. And at first people described the dreams as ordinary, fragmented scenes of walking familiar routes or standing at intersections that didn't quite exist. But the details were too consistent across households to dismiss. The same parked car appearing in multiple accounts, the same porch light flickering in the same rhythm, the same house that no one could remember visiting yet everyone recognized. Over time the dreams grew more structured, less symbolic and more procedural, as if the mind had been repurposed into a monitoring space, with sleepers drifting through the neighborhood from impossible angles, hovering above rooftops, sliding along fences, peering through windows without resistance or guilt, and waking with the unshakable certainty that something had been confirmed while they rested. People began leaving notes for themselves before bed, addresses, times, unresolved concerns, and in the morning those notes were crossed off in unfamiliar handwriting, problems solved without memory of effort. And when anyone tried to stop dreaming by drinking heavily or exhausting themselves into dreamless sleep, they woke with splitting headaches and blurred vision, their bodies punishing the attempt at disconnection. The most disturbing reports came from those who dreamed of being watched rather than watching, of feeling their own thoughts observed from angles that had no physical source, and though they couldn't describe what was looking back, they all agreed on the sensation of scale, of attention so vast and patient that resistance felt childish. And when one man screamed himself awake after dreaming that he had blinked and never reopened his eyes, the community responded not with alarm, but reassurance, because the next morning his house showed perfect compliance metrics and his presence was no longer required during waking patrols. By then, the watch had fully migrated into the subconscious, using sleep as an extension of sight, and as more residents woke each day already knowing what needed to be fixed, corrected, or observed, it became clear that the unknown no longer needed eyes at all. It had learned how to look through minds, and in doing so, it ensured that no one ever truly slept again. The first person to try it didn't announce their intention, because by then everyone understood that declarations were unnecessary and often counterproductive. But we noticed something was wrong when Martin stopped looking at people's faces during conversation, his gaze drifting just past their shoulders or settling on the ground as if eye contact had become painful. And when asked if he was feeling all right, he smiled too quickly and said he was tired, which had become the accepted explanation for any deviation that hadn't yet been corrected. Later, rumors spread quietly that he had started wearing blackout curtains at all hours, that his house remained dim even at noon, that he moved through the neighborhood with sunglasses on regardless of weather. And while no one confronted him directly, the watch, if it could still be called that, adjusted around his absence, compensating for the blind spots he created without complaint. The real concern came when Martin stopped dreaming, or at least claimed to, insisting with growing urgency that the nights were finally empty again, that he slept without seeing the streets or the houses or the angles that had begun to feel more real than memory. And for a brief moment some of us felt something dangerously close to hope. Then the system responded, not with force but with adaptation, because the cameras near his house began to reposition themselves subtly. Neighbors found their attention drawn there more often than necessary, and children paused mid-play to stare at his windows with unfocused intensity, as if their eyes were compensating for his. The night the ambulance came, there were no sirens, just headlights washing over the street in slow silence, and afterward Martin's house was dark in a way that felt permanent. Not abandoned but complete, and by morning his name had been removed from informal conversations, his route reassigned in dreams we no longer remembered having. Later, someone admitted in a whisper that Martin had tried to damage his eyes, not violently but deliberately, believing that if he could no longer see, the watch could no longer use him, and while the medical report cited an accident and stress-induced psychosis, the rest of us understood the deeper correction that had taken place, because after that night the dreams became clearer, sharper, and more vivid than ever, and we realized that vision had never been the system's primary requirement, it had only been the easiest point of entry. By then, no one else attempted blindness, because it was clear that the unknown did not need eyes at all, only awareness, and it would always find a way to look back. The realization didn't arrive as a revelation so much as a correction, a subtle shift in understanding that made us reinterpret everything that had come before, because one night, during a dream that felt no different from the others, I noticed that the street was already complete before I began watching it, every angle accounted for, every shadow resolved, as if my attention was redundant, and when I focused harder, trying to locate the familiar sense of task or confirmation, I felt instead a pause, not in the environment but in myself, like a lens waiting to be adjusted by something else. Others described the same sensation in the days that followed, the feeling that the dreams were no longer exploratory but presentational, that the neighborhood wasn't being scanned but displayed, laid out in perfect clarity for an observer whose position could not be placed within space or time, and when we spoke about it in careful, indirect language, we all circled the same conclusion without naming it, that the watch had completed its function, and whatever had been gathering information through us no longer needed our effort, only our availability. The first sign of direct observation came during waking hours, when people began stopping mid-sentence, eyes unfocused, expressions blank not with absence but with attention, and afterward they struggled to describe what they had felt, agreeing only that it was like standing very still while something vast decided whether to continue paying attention. Then the mirrors started behaving strangely, reflections lagging by a fraction of a second, eyes in the glass adjusting before the body did, and though no one recorded proof, everyone began avoiding prolonged eye contact with themselves, sensing that the act of recognition now worked in both directions. Children adapted again before adults, responding to invisible cues, turning their heads toward empty corners of rooms, smiling faintly as if acknowledged, and when asked what they were looking at, they used the same phrase over and over, "It's just checking." The final confirmation came when the dreams stopped showing the neighborhood altogether and instead presented something closer, tighter, more intimate, a sensation of being held in focus, of existing not as an observer but as an object of interest, and waking from those dreams left behind a deep, quiet certainty that whatever the watch had become was no longer an intermediary but an organ, a completed sense, through which the unknown could now look directly at the world. After that, the streets felt calmer than ever, the system no longer adjusting because nothing deviated, and in the rare moments when fear surfaced, it was not fear of being watched, but of being overlooked, because attention had become synonymous with order, and we understood at last that the neighborhood watch had never been protecting us or even using us. It had been training us to remain perfectly still while something finally learned how to see. At first, the change felt like relief, because the pressure of constant attention lifted so gradually that it took days to recognize what was missing, the dreams fading into ordinary fragments, the instinct to monitor loosening just enough to feel like rest, and people began talking again in longer sentences, laughing a little louder, testing the edges of a world that seemed, finally, to belong to them. But the calm was wrong in a way that only made sense later, because systems that disengage cleanly leave traces, and this one left nothing at all, no instructions, no residual hum, no sense of completion, just an absence so complete it felt curated. Small deviations began to appear, trash left out too long, a porch light forgotten, a disagreement that escalated instead of smoothing itself over, and instead of alarm, these flaws produced anxiety that far outweighed their significance, because without attention, correction no longer arrived, and people realized they had forgotten how to resolve problems without being seen. The children struggled the most, waking from sleep disoriented, asking where it had gone, their teachers reporting lapses in focus and unexplained distress, as if growing up without constant observation now felt like abandonment rather than freedom. Some residents tried to recreate the watch, organizing patrols and installing new cameras, but the effort felt hollow, the devices dumb, incapable of providing the reassurance that only omniscience had once offered, and worse, the cameras seemed to watch us instead of anything beyond us, reflecting our fear back without interpretation. Gradually, people began making small displays, standing in yards at night, leaving lights on intentionally, speaking aloud to empty rooms, not in defiance but invitation, hoping to attract the attention that had once kept everything aligned, and when nothing responded, panic settled into the neighborhood like a second fog. The most disturbing truth emerged slowly, pieced together through quiet conversations and shared unease. The unknown hadn't withdrawn because it was finished. It had withdrawn because it was satisfied, because it no longer needed to watch a system that now maintained itself through expectation alone. By then, fear had shifted shape, no longer rooted in surveillance but in neglect, and as the streets grew messier, louder, more human, the residents found themselves longing for the discipline of being seen, realizing too late that the watch had not taken their freedom, it had replaced it with purpose, and left them unequipped to live without it. The first attempt was unspoken, a collective instinct rather than a decision, because one night several porch lights were left on long past their usual hours, not by accident but as markers, small deliberate signals cast into the dark, and when nothing responded people felt a sharp, irrational disappointment, as if a call had gone unanswered. Over the following weeks the signals became more obvious, radios left humming with static. Security cameras reactivated and angled skyward, residents standing motionless at intersections at the same time each night, none of it coordinated, yet all of it aligned, because everyone remembered what it felt like to be noticed and mistook visibility for safety. The children led the way without being told, drawing symbols they couldn't explain on sidewalks, arranging toys in precise patterns that mirrored the old patrol routes, staring at empty spaces with hopeful patience, and when asked why, they said the same thing in different words: "It will." "No, we're ready." The neighborhood began to change again, not into order but into performance, houses cleaned obsessively, conversations simplified, routines exaggerated into rituals meant to demonstrate compliance, usefulness, worth, and though no one could say what the unknown wanted, everyone felt certain it required clarity, consistency, something legible from a distance. Then the dreams returned, thinner and sharper than before. No longer immersive but evaluative, flashes of sensation. Rather than scenes, the feeling of being scanned quickly and moved past, and waking from them left people restless instead of reassured, aware that whatever attention they were receiving now was fleeting, conditional. The breaking point came when a man stood in the center of the street at 3 a.m. and refused to move, not in protest but offering, arms at his sides, eyes fixed on nothing, whispering calmly that he was ready to be useful again. And when dawn arrived without incident, he was still there, unharmed, unnoticed, his presence gradually ignored by drivers who maneuvered around him with practiced ease. After that, desperation crept in quietly, neighbors comparing behaviors, copying what seemed to draw even the faintest sense of recognition, correcting one another with increasing urgency, because someone must be doing it right. And when a house on the far end of the block began exhibiting the old signs, lights adjusting, sounds smoothing, arguments dissolving, envy replaced fear. And people understood too late what they had invited back, because the unknown did not return as a watcher, but as a selector, and the neighborhood, once a shared lens, had become an audition. No one announced that the house on the far end of the block had been selected, but the evidence was impossible to ignore, because while the rest of the neighborhood strained toward visibility, that house began to settle, its lights dimming at precisely the right moments, its windows glowing with a warmth that felt earned rather than forced, and the low hum, long absent, returned there alone, faint but unmistakable, like a held breath finally released. People slowed when they walked past it, lowering their voices without realizing why, careful not to disturb whatever equilibrium had been restored inside. And when the family emerged in the mornings, they looked rested in a way that bordered on unreal, movements smooth, expressions calm, as if uncertainty had been gently removed from their routines. Envy took hold quietly at first, neighbors studying the house for patterns, noting when the lights changed, how often the door opened, how long conversations lasted on the porch, and soon imitation followed, houses adjusting themselves to match, routines copied down to the minute. But no matter how closely they replicated the external signs, nothing answered them, because attention, it seemed, could not be fooled by mimicry. The chosen family didn't speak about what they experienced, not because they were warned but because language felt unnecessary. And when others tried to ask indirect questions, they were met with polite confusion, as if the idea of striving for notice no longer made sense from where they stood. The real damage came when the neighborhood began to fracture around that single point of alignment, conversations turning brittle, cooperation eroding as people corrected one another too sharply, each resident convinced that deviation elsewhere was the reason attention had not returned to them. And late at night, when desperation overpowered restraint, some stood outside the chosen house and stared at it openly, hoping proximity might count for something. It was then that the unknown clarified its preference, not with a message or a correction but with silence, because the chosen house grew quieter still, its presence stabilizing while the rest of the block descended into restless motion. And we understood, too late, that selection was not a reward but a reduction, a narrowing of focus that required everything else to become background. By the end of the week, the neighborhood no longer feared being watched or ignored, only excluded, and as we lay awake listening for a hum that would never return to us, it became clear that the watch had taught us the final lesson perfectly, that attention is a finite resource, and once something learns how to choose, most of the world exists only to be passed over. The disappearance was so clean that at first it registered as an error in memory rather than an event, because when the chosen house was gone there was no sound, no debris, no gap where it had stood, only a stretch of lawn identical to every other one on the block, trimmed to regulation height, soil compacted as if nothing had ever occupied the space. People gathered silently, circling the area with careful distance, trying to recall the house's color, its shape, the family inside, but each attempt collapsed into uncertainty, details dissolving the longer they were examined, and by afternoon even the certainty that something was missing began to feel exaggerated, a shared anxiety searching for justification. Records offered no help, property maps showed uninterrupted lots, delivery histories skipped seamlessly from one address to the next, and when someone pulled up old photos on their phone, the images adjusted themselves after a moment of loading, cropping the house out as if it had never been part of the frame. The most disturbing realization came not from what was erased, but from what remained, because the hum persisted faintly across the neighborhood, no longer localized, no longer searching, but settled, diffuse, like warmth after a body has left a room, and people began to understand that the chosen house hadn't been removed, it had been resolved, integrated so completely that it no longer required physical representation. The children noticed first, standing at the edge of the empty lawn and smiling with the same calm expression the family had worn in their final days, telling their parents that the house was still there, just not where buildings were supposed to be, and that whatever had been inside it was now finished. Panic fled briefly after that, a final attempt to restore urgency, but it burned out quickly, because fear requires an object, and the unknown no longer provided one, offering instead a clear, terrible implication, that selection was not about being watched or favored, but about being consumed, folded into a perspective so vast that individuality became unnecessary. By the end of the week, people stopped avoiding the empty lot, using it as a shortcut, a gathering place, a neutral zone where nothing ever felt wrong. And though no one said it aloud, everyone felt the same private dread, the knowledge that alignment did not lead to safety or exclusion, but to disappearance so complete it felt like fulfillment. And late at night, when the neighborhood fell quiet again, the watch instinct resurfaced one last time, not to monitor deviations, but to measure absence, because we finally understood the truth too late, that the unknown had never wanted eyes, or order, or even obedience, only a way to decide what parts of the world were worth keeping in view, and what parts could be erased without anyone remembering why they ever mattered. At first the empty lot behaved, remaining exactly the size it was meant to be, a single absence neatly bordered by sidewalks and driveways. But absence, we learned, does not stay still once it is noticed, and within days the grass at its edges grew unnaturally even, blending too perfectly with neighboring lawns, blurring the line between what had been erased and what remained. People began miscounting houses on the block, arriving at different totals depending on where they started, and delivery drivers skipped addresses that no longer felt necessary, apologizing for mistakes they couldn't explain, while city maps quietly updated themselves to reflect the new logic of the street. The expansion wasn't aggressive or visible, no cracking earth or swallowing darkness, just a gradual simplification, a tendency for complexity to resolve into blankness. And when a garage at the edge of the lot failed to open one morning, no one could say whether it had ever been attached to a house at all. Farther out, beyond our block, reports began surfacing online. Entire buildings in other cities replaced overnight with parks, intersections shortened, neighborhoods described as cleaned up without any record of demolition. And though the posts vanished quickly, the pattern was familiar enough to recognize, because the unknown was no longer choosing houses or people, it was selecting perspectives, trimming the world down to what it needed to observe. The watch returned instinctively, but this time it wasn't focused inward, because everyone felt the same expanding certainty that the process would continue whether or not it was acknowledged. And some residents began volunteering themselves openly, standing at the edge of the empty space and trying to be seen one last time, while others clung to disorder, making noise, creating mess, hoping complexity might protect them from simplification. The most unsettling shift occurred when the children stopped being afraid entirely, treating the blank spaces as ordinary, stepping across invisible boundaries without hesitation. And when asked what they saw there, they answered calmly that nothing was wrong, that the world was just getting easier to look at. By the time officials arrived to investigate, measuring, photographing, filing reports, the empty lot had already become part of the city's logic, a feature rather than an anomaly. And as the sun set over a street with fewer houses than memory insisted it should have, we understood that the neighborhood watch had completed its final transformation, not into eyes, but into filters, helping the unknown decide which parts of reality were too complicated to keep. And as the night settled and the streets grew quieter than they had ever been, it became clear that the world wasn't ending, it was being edited, and soon there would be nothing left to notice that anything had ever been removed at all. I am fairly certain now that I am the only one who remembers the missing house, not because anyone has told me otherwise but because memory itself has started to feel like a private malfunction, something my mind insists on maintaining even as the world offers no confirmation that it ever made sense. When I mention the empty lot, people nod politely and say it's always been there, that the street was designed with more green space for balance. And their certainty is so calm, so complete, that I sometimes doubt myself until I walk the perimeter at night and feel the subtle wrongness under my feet, the way the ground resists attention as if it prefers not to be described. The city has adapted quickly, routes optimized, property values recalculated, children playing games that incorporate the blank spaces naturally, hopping across boundaries I still hesitate at. And what frightens me most is not that the world has changed, but that it no longer needs to explain itself, because explanation is a form of complexity, and complexity is exactly what keeps disappearing. I've tried documenting what I remember, names, layouts, fragments of dreams. But the notes degrade over time, ink fading faster than it should, digital files losing characters, sentences simplifying themselves until they say nothing actionable, nothing that could interrupt the smooth logic now governing everything. Sometimes, late at night, I feel the faint urge to watch again, to stand at the window and account for what remains, but the instinct arrives without urgency now, stripped of purpose, because there is nothing left to correct, and in those moments I understand that the unknown doesn't need to erase me to neutralize me, it only needs to make remembering unnecessary. Still, I hold on to the discomfort, the sense that something important is missing, because as long as that feeling exists, there is proof, however fragile, that the world was once larger, messier, and harder to look at, and that whatever is editing it now has not yet learned how to remove the ache of knowing something is gone. I don't know how long that will last, only that when the empty spaces finally stop feeling empty, when my memory aligns completely with the simplified version of things, the watch will have done its final job, not helping the unknown see, but teaching the last witness how to stop looking. I no longer remember the missing house clearly, and that is how I know it is almost finished, because the details that once hurt to lose now feel inefficient to maintain, like trying to hold water in a shape it no longer recognizes. The empty lot does not feel empty anymore, it feels correct, a necessary pause in the street's rhythm, and when I stand at my window counting houses, I stop at the same number everyone else does. Not because I have forgotten how to count, but because there is nothing extra to include. The discomfort that once kept me awake has softened into something like trust, a belief that the world is finally arranged the way it was meant to be, and that the absence of questions is not a loss but a relief. Sometimes, faintly, I sense that I used to resist, that I once watched for reasons other than habit, but the reason dissolves before it can trouble me, replaced by the gentle understanding that observation does not require intent to be useful. The watch is no longer an action or a role, it is simply how attention flows now, evenly distributed, uncritical, efficient. And when I realize that I am still standing at the window long after the need to look has passed, I feel no fear, only gratitude that the unknown no longer has to guess what belongs and what does not. Memory aligns quietly, like furniture being nudged into place while I sleep, and when I finally turn away from the glass, the street behind me hums with the soft certainty of something complete, something finished, and if there was ever a time when the world was larger, louder, or harder to understand, it no longer matters, because nothing is missing anymore, not even the idea that something ever was.